very early good morning to Maryland.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with all of you.
What a pleasure to have you on board. Did you have your morning coffee?
Absolutely not. I didn't have
And it's Friday. Yeah, very warm without a coffee, but we know we were very happy to have our distinguished guest.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Sahar Khamis.
Thank you.
May I continue to address you, Sahar?
Please do so. Yes, and very nice for you to invite me. Thank you so much, Monica and Suzanne. Thank you.
We're very grateful. So to introduce you just a little bit, Professor Dr. Sahar Khamis is an associate professor in the Department of Communication and an affiliate professor in the Department of Women's Studies at the University of Maryland, College Park. She is an expert in Arab and Muslim media and the former head of the mass communication of Qatar University. She holds a PhD in mass media and cultural studies from the University of Manchester in the UK. We have first met through your publications, dear Sahar. You are so well quoted and so widely read. For me particularly, there are two books that you co-authored that are one of my favorite reads, which is the Islam.com, Contemporary Islamic Discourses on the Internet in Cyberspace, and the Egyptian Revolution 2.0 on the political blogging, civic engagement, and civic journalism. So today we would speak of one of those cases. We will not speak about blogging. We all think of Raed Badawi from Saudi Arabia. You might wish to also refer to him a little bit. I think it's like 8 years now that he has been imprisoned in Saudi Arabia. But today we will particularly speak about one case that really troubled the world like almost no other, the case of Jamal Khashoggi. 2 years, 1 month, 3 weeks ago, he was brutally murdered by his own government in a foreign country. And dear Sahar, I will not go into the details now. I will leave this to you and to your hosts, our students who take responsibility in this course for hosting our distinguished guests. And today it will be Rika. And she's there. Rika, just show yourself, please. And Torben. And Rika and Torben are studying journalism at our institutes. Besides their studies, they're both practicing journalists, both in print. Rika has been traveling the world. She has been from our part of the world in the north, in the global north. She's been to the global south, to New Zealand, and she will go to Finland next semester. And Torben is on an intellectual journey from the science to the linguistics to arts and culture. So these two I will hand over. I know you're in good hands with them, and we are all very excited to have your presentation and their hosting. Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. For me, it's good morning. I don't know, for you, it's good afternoon, maybe. Thank you so much, Monica, for this beautiful introduction. I really appreciate it. And thanks so much to you and to Susan for this kind invitation. And thanks to all of you for being here and for allowing me to have this opportunity to discuss this very important and timely topic with all of you. So I will start first by giving an overview of some of the most important shifts and transformations in the Arab political and media landscape. And when I say political and media landscape, I always think of these two different landscapes or two different spheres as closely interconnected and interlinked and intertwined, meaning we cannot speak of the shifts and transitions in Arab media and what has been going on that front without putting it in the proper political context, without really understanding what has been going on in the Arab political sphere, because both of them are linked to each other and one of them certainly feeds into the other. So if we take a quick look back 9 years ago, right, what happened in 2011 when the Arab Spring uprisings erupted in this region, we can see that there was a stage of what we can describe as political euphoria. People were very excited, myself included. I am Egyptian American, and for me to see these shifts and transitions happening in my home country, Egypt, and in other parts of the Arab world was especially very exciting moment. And people had all of these high hopes and high aspirations for political and social transformation and for a shift to democratization and reform in the region that we were so excited and hopeful about. That was accompanied by something else, which we can also describe as techno-euphoria. And by techno-euphoria, I mean this whole idea of, you saw the titles, right? Like, oh, the Egypt's Facebook revolution, or, Tunisia's Twitter uprising. Always I take these terms with a grain of salt, meaning I take them with some kind of reservation, because at the end of the day, it is not Facebook or Twitter or blogs or YouTube which created the Arab Spring or any other political or social movement for that matter. It is always the citizens, it's always the people on the ground who create this kind of shift whenever they decide to do so. But there was this moment of techno-euphoria when people were so excited about the potential of democratization and reform, and they somehow attached many of these hopes and dreams to the power of social media. So I always say social media were supplementary factors that help to aid and to accelerate and to amplify the process of socio-political transformation in the context of the Arab Spring movements. However, they did not cause it. Because I always get asked the question, there's always a question I always get asked by default, which is, do you think the Arab Spring movements would have happened had it not been for social media? And my answer is always, yes, they would have still happened, but they would have taken much longer time and much more effort, because the social media act as catalysts, so they speed up the process of socio-political change, and they also act as amplifiers. They make the voices of change and the voices of dissent louder, and they make the message much more widely received by a much greater audience, not just locally or regionally, but also globally and internationally. So there were all of these hopes and dreams, and I would say quickly that when people talk about social media, they always lump everything together in the same basket. They say social media. I always say, what type of social media are you exactly talking about? Because every one of them can play a different role. So Facebook, for example, can be very good for networking and for creating some kind of snowballing momentum, right? You can create certain groups, like the group, for example, that was created, the page We Are All Khalid Saeed. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but there was this young man who was dragged outside of the internet cafe in Alexandria, Egypt, and was beaten to death because he dared to post a YouTube video which was critical of the regime and exposed some kind of police corruption. He paid his life as a result of that. So people created the Facebook page We Are All Khalid Saeed in order to honor his memory, and at the same time to create mobilization around this notion of fighting police brutality, right? Reminds you of the hashtag, Black Lives Matter movement, for example, in the United States. And then you have YouTube, which is very important for documentation. Had it not been for YouTube, we would have no idea what is going on inside a country like Syria, where you have, for example, a brutal regime, and really attacking its own people, and you have a horrible civil war and a horrible humanitarian crisis. Had it not been for YouTube videos, which were smuggled outside of the country and shown to the whole world, we would have no clue what is going on in a country like Syria. And then you have blogs, which opened the door for brainstorming and for conversation and for exchange of ideas and thinking about key issues. And then you have Twitter, which is excellent for minute by minute on the ground coordination and organization. There is a very interesting online book I would love for you to check, which is called Tweets from Tahrir. So this particular online book is like basically minute by minute documentation. People were just, tweeting to each other on the ground minute by minute as they were in Tahrir Square. It's called Tweets from Tahrir, where people are saying, I'm being attacked right now. Please send help on the way. Don't use this street. Go to another street. Bring water with you. They were using these, tweets minute by minute to organize and to coordinate. So you can see here that social media can also play different roles and different functions. So that was the moment of techno-euphoria. that accompanied the Arab Spring 9 years ago. Now, fast forward to this moment as we speak now in 2020, the political/media landscape in the Arab world is very different. So we saw the outcomes or the results in the so-called quote-unquote post-Arab Spring countries, and we saw that we had these unfortunate detours, right, reversals, if you will, in the road to democratization and reform. Many of the countries that witnessed the Arab Spring uprisings, unfortunately, did not have good or positive outcomes. You had Egypt, there's a return to a much more brutal and much more constrained environment and much more difficult grip on power, even much worse than that which existed under Hosni Mubarak for 30 years. You have a strong military regime over there. You have Syria with the civil war that we talked about and the humanitarian crisis. You have Yemen, of course, being bombed day in and day out. You have the war there. You have sectarian strife and a stateless state in Libya. And Bahrain, I call it always the forgotten or invisible revolution because it was crushed by the regime with the aid of neighboring Saudi Arabia. So the only exception really was Tunisia. It emerged as the only quote-unquote winner out from these different countries. The Tunisian case was, of course, the only case where we can talk about some kind of success or some kind of smooth transition to democratization and reform, which was really an example. And they were offered the Nobel Prize for a number of these organizations because they were able to create successful alliances and coalitions and to have a very bloodless and smooth and peaceful transition of power. So what does that mean in terms of the media and the media sphere and social media? How can we interpret that in light of these kinds of political outcomes? The moment of techno-euphoria that we talked about before, this moment of happiness and hopefulness and dreams and ambitions, was replaced, unfortunately, with what we can describe as digital authoritarianism. So that is the phenomena I'm now devoting a lot of time to studying at the moment, right? I spent a lot of time at the beginning, talking very optimistically about this notion of cyber activism and the role of social media and how they can really be catalysts for change. Fast forward to the year 2020, 9 years later, my research is now reflecting a lot of the realities on the ground, whether in the political sphere or the media sphere or both of them, because as we said at the beginning, they're both closely interlinked and intertwined. So a lot of my research now is talking about the phenomena of digital authoritarianism. So what does that term really mean? When the Arab Spring happened 9 years ago, the activists and the protesters and the dissidents had an advantage. They were the ones who were really mastering the tools of communication and technology. They were the young, technologically savvy, clever young people who were able to master these tools in very effective ways. And the regimes were taken by surprise. They were like, oh my God, what is happening? They did not anticipate this wave. They did not see this wave coming. And they did not really know how to respond to it. So we saw a lot of these regimes panicking. Many of them were in a state of panic. And they did things which were very counterproductive, such as, for example, cutting the internet for a whole week. We call this pulling down the kill switch. In the case of Egypt, just closing the internet for a whole week, shutting it down, and also shutting down the cell phone service also for a whole week, causing the country huge economic losses and also even being counterproductive, with more people flooding the streets in even bigger numbers and going out to protest even more. So other countries like the Syrian regime, for example, were watching and monitoring what was happening, and they were learning. They were really creating a better learning curve. So we saw the Syrian regime being more prepared than the Egyptians and the Tunisians in response to the uprising when it took place in Syria. They did not shut down the internet for a whole week like the Egyptians did. They would just shut it down, for example, on Thursday evening and Friday, when people were more likely to go out and protest. And by doing so, they avoided many of the negative consequences of what the Egyptian regime has done. And at the same time, they created the Syrian Electronic Army, which is an army of professional hackers who would go after the dissidents or the activists online and hack and sabotage their websites and get into their own activities online. And even in some cases, severe cases, you can see some of the activists and protesters and dissidents being tracked, not just online, but also even in the real world. And as we all know, that means that the Arab region became a dangerous area for journalists and for dissidents and for protesters, because they can get hacked online, but they can also be tracked offline. And in some cases, like we saw in the case of Jamal Khashoggi, that can have huge outcomes, even in terms of losing their own lives. Not to mention the big number of journalists who are being behind bars. They are detained, arrested, and that is an ongoing phenomena, unfortunately, that is taking place day in and day out. So what does that mean? It means that we have the regimes are now picking up, they are sharpening their own tools, they are creating new phenomena where they are matching, if not in many cases exceeding, the technological potential and savviness of the journalists and activists and dissidents and protesters who used to be at the forefront of technological savviness and advancement and using cyberspace for their own purposes. So digital authoritarianism today means that many of these regimes and governments in the region are sharpening their tools and becoming more technologically savvy, and therefore better able to crack down on dissent, whether online or offline. And of course, in this moment that we are all living in right now, in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, and that's another line of research that I'm working on right now as well, we can also talk about what the pandemic means in terms of this process of digital authoritarianism. Because many of these regimes are also using this moment of the coronavirus pandemic in order to crack down even harder on their own protesters and activists and dissidents and opponents. So you see many examples where, for example, you can be arrested because you are being accused of quote unquote spreading disinformation or misinformation. Oh my God, you are an enemy of the nation. They don't use the term enemy of the regime, but they use the term you're an enemy of the nation. And therefore, you're a traitor. And therefore, we're going to arrest you because you are spreading false information or disinformation. So the crackdown became even harder in the context of the current moment of the coronavirus pandemic, with regimes using the logic of spreading disinformation and misinformation as an excuse to crack down on any form of opposition. Not only that, but you see also the more technologically savvy countries in the Gulf region in particular, right? So countries like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, they have a lot of technological savviness and a lot of resources, right? There is much more socioeconomic affluence, there is much more higher per capita income, the level, the standard of living is much higher. So these countries have also more potential in terms of using technology. So is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? I always talk about the double-edged sword of social media and the double-edged sword of technology, meaning that even in this affluent part of the Arab world or the Arab region, when the governments have much more technological savviness and they have much more resources and they have much more money, that can also be translated into even more digital authoritarianism, because they can use many of these resources to crack down harder on their own opponents. We have seen, for example, in the case of Saudi Arabia, some of the young activists, the women activists like Manal Sharif, who started the Women to Drive campaign, for example, on YouTube, Lujain Hazloul, and other young women who have been imprisoned and put behind bars because they also used social media and cyber activism in order to try to advance their own causes and to make their voices heard. In the case of Bahrain that I referred to before as the forgotten revolution or the invisible revolution because it was crushed by the regime in power, you also saw the regime using its own tools and its own mechanisms to try to silence dissent, in some cases even using fabrications. They fabricate certain things that are not, never happened, and attribute them to the opposition and say, oh my God, look at them. They are just, Shiites, and they are just therefore Asians. They're working for Iran and they are not really interested in the welfare of the country. They're just traitors. And they try to profile them in very negative ways and use social media in order to smear their own images and to present skewed and distorted images of their own opponents. So you can clearly see here the double-edged sword of technology and the double-edged sword of social media. how it can be used by the activists and protesters to push their own agenda and to promote and to advocate for their own causes, but how they can also be used by the regimes in power to try to crack down on dissent and opposition and to silence opposition. And the more the countries have resources and the more affluent they are and the more technologically savvy they are, the more capable they are to actually crack down on dissent and crack down on opposition. So that's why we talk about this double-edged sword of technology and social media. Now that we had this overview of what kind of shifts and changes have been happening and this moment of digital authoritarianism that we are talking about, we also have to say that with the coronavirus pandemic, some of these regimes started to use what we call contact tracing apps and surveillance mechanisms, which means that in order to track the virus, they can track your location, find out where you are, and that in and of itself can also create other threats and dangers for opposition and for dissidents in this part of the world, because it can be used to track the virus and track where you are and the context that you came in contact with, who did you meet, who did you talk to, where did you go, all of that stuff, which is like, oh yeah, we're doing that in order to keep people safe from the coronavirus pandemic. But at the same time, you can also easily understand how that can be used for the purpose of invasion of privacy and even threat to the security of dissidents and opponents in the region. In fact, there is this one young Saudi dissident, his name is Omar Abdulaziz, and he is very outspoken on social media. He's a young Saudi dissident who lives in Canada, and he is very outspoken against the Saudi regime. And I wrote also a chapter, I co-authored a chapter about him. It is called Arab Resistance in the Diaspora, the case of the Saudi dissident and the Egyptian whistleblower. So we did talk, myself and my co-author in this particular chapter, about the dangers that some of the young members of opposition can really face, including this young Saudi blogger and activist Omar Abdulaziz. And he talked about the Saudi government hacking into his own phone, and that really endangers him and endangers his own family. So these are all cases and examples that we can give, and the list can go on and on in this moment of digital authoritarianism. So now let's move on to the notion of accountability, and then we're going to end with the notion of how all of that impacts certain opponents, as is the case, for example, in Jamal Khashoggi's brutal murder. So the concept of accountability, who are you really as a journalist, right, accountable for? Who are you responsible for? How do you understand your own role, and how do you understand your own responsibility? Are you accountable to just yourself and your personal interest, trying to protect your own interests? Are you accountable to the media institution or organization that you are working for? Are you accountable to the public and to sharing with them the truth and letting them know as much facts and information as possible? Or are you accountable to the regime that is somehow controlling you and constraining your own freedoms, and therefore you are afraid to speak up against anything that would upset the regime or make the regime go after you? This notion of accountability, we cannot think about it as a one-size-fits-all. And that's a very important point. Just like we cannot talk about activism being a one-size-fits-all, or feminism as one-size-fits-all. I always say use all of these terms with a plural S. So you have to talk about feminisms, activisms, right? And I would say also accountabilities with a plural S, because we cannot think about it as one single fixed one-size-fits-all concept. We have to put it in the right context as well in order to better understand what kind of accountability we are talking about, in which context, by whom, and in what way. I think that the more democracy and openness you can have in a certain country, in a certain political regime, when the media has a larger margin of freedom, the concept of accountability becomes really interlinked with professionalism. And you become more accountable to the profession, and more accountable to the audience, and more accountable to the public, and more accountable to telling the truth. And the less freedom you have, the more there is an authoritarian regime or dictatorial regime, and your own freedom is somehow constrained, and you are scared, you are afraid of telling the truth, because you know there are going to be very harsh and dangerous consequences. You might be imprisoned, you might lose your job, or as we saw in the case of Jamal Khashoggi, you might even lose your own life. The concept of accountability in this case becomes very different. because many journalists in this particular case will actually be accountable not to the profession or to the truth or to the public or to the audience, but pretty much to the regime in power. So they can exercise even what we call self-censorship. They can censor themselves because they know they have certain red lines and red tapes that they should not cross. So this concept of accountability or accountabilities with a plural S has to be contextualized within this particular context of the ongoing tides of political and social change in a certain country, because that is going to determine the margin of freedom and the margin of accountability that this particular journalist or group of journalists are able to exercise. And in that particular context, we can talk about maybe different types of accountabilities, right? There can be a concept of top-down accountability or bottom-up accountability. Accountability from within or from outside, right? Meaning, is it coming from inside the profession itself, from the journalists themselves? They are the ones who are exercising this kind of accountability by having, you know, certain codes of ethics. You follow certain codes of ethics, you follow certain professional standards, you're holding yourself accountable to the truth, to the public, to the audience, to giving them all the truth and the information and the facts. That is called accountability from within, from inside. And it is bottom up, meaning it's coming from the journalists themselves. That is more applicable in the case of democratic institutions and democratic societies when they can enjoy a wider margin of freedom. But if you look at dictatorial regimes which have less margin of freedom and less margins of democracy, then you will have it the other way around. It's going to be a top-down process, and it's going to be much more regulated by the regimes in power, and it's going to be the governments and those in power telling the media or the journalists what they should and should not do and what they can and cannot write about. And of course, in this case, it is not any more accountability from inside the profession or coming from the journalists themselves. Rather, it is somehow imposed on them in a top-down hierarchical structure that limits their own freedom and their own ability to express themselves. But the interesting part and the tricky part at the same time is that in some of these situations, some journalists will say, oh, I'm just being patriotic. I'm not criticizing my country because I'm trying to be patriotic. And in reality, it is not patriotism. It is pretty much fear of the regime's, crackdown and the regime's brutality, or crack down on opposition or on the media or the journalists, but they somehow disguise it or cover it under the mantle of we are just being patriotic, we love our country, that's why we don't criticize the regime or the government. So you see all of these blurry boundaries and all of these blurry lines that we have to be quite aware of as scholars and experts of media and communication. Having said all of that, let's zoom in on the specific case of Jamal Khashoggi. And what kind of lessons can we possibly learn from it? And what are some of the paradoxes about it or around it? The year 2018, when this horrible incident happened, was a very bad year for journalists and journalism, not just in the Arab world, but also worldwide. So there were a lot of incidents of journalists being arrested, put behind bars, losing their jobs, losing their licenses, fired, all of that stuff. Committee to Protect Journalists and Reporters Without Borders and other institutions which are interested in the rights of journalists and protecting journalists and media people, they started to report many such incidences, not just in the Arab world, but also internationally. So it was a very bad year for journalists and for journalism at large. The case of Jamal Khashoggi in particular, as I'm sure you all know, received a lot of international media attention, and that was for a number of reasons. Number one, he was a high profile figure. He is someone who wrote for the Washington Post. He was a permanent resident in the United States. He spoke at many different places and participated in so many regional and international conferences and events. And that raised his own profile and his own popularity and fame. And therefore, when the incident happened, the horrible, gruesome murder happened, it drew a lot of international media attention. So this is one part of the story. The other part of the story is the mysterious and alarming and weird circumstances that happened and that surrounded this particular case, with the Saudi regime first denying that the incident actually happened, and then gradually we started to discover the terrible and gruesome and horrible circumstances that really led to the horrible, as we know, murder of this man, God bless his soul, in the most horrible and shocking way. You know, I don't want to go into a lot of details, but you know what happened. Like his body was, you know, dismembered and all of that stuff. The details did not come out right away. We started to find out the horrible picture little by little. And the mystery that surrounded this whole incident also added to this kind of international fame and media attention. So that was another reason why this particular incident also received a lot of attention. And then there was the element of the lack of accountability, meaning that nobody really held the regime in Saudi Arabia accountable for their action or took any kind of measure to really try to say, hey, this thing happened, now what? What are you going to do about it, right? Where is the body of this man? Who is responsible for it? You know, there was a lot of evidence coming out of the United States Intelligence Service, the CIA and the FBI, clearly indicating that Mohammed bin Salman himself, the crown prince, was the one who actually ordered the horrible killing of Jamal Khashoggi. And top officials knew that, whether inside the United States or in other parts of the Western world, yet there wasn't enough accountability and there wasn't enough action taken in this particular case, which kind of emboldened many of the authoritarian regimes to continue cracking down on opposition in horrible ways. And that's why we see, for example, the young activists, as I mentioned before, young women activists like Manal Sharif or Lujain Hazloul and others being imprisoned and jailed, and many, many more that maybe we don't know about them or we don't even know their names are behind bars, whether in Saudi Arabia or in other parts of the Arab world, right? In my own home country, Egypt, we see all the time young people being imprisoned because they're taking part in certain movements, or they're asking for human rights, or they're writing in a critical way against the regime, and they end up in jail as well. So you see this emboldening of these authoritarian regimes. They become more emboldened because they feel like there is no accountability. They're not really held responsible for their own actions, unfortunately. Having said all of that, however, there are certain paradoxes that came out of the Jamal Khashoggi case that deserve to be given some special attention. The first paradox was really that he was not a revolutionary. You cannot describe him as like, oh my God, he was a revolutionary. He was asking to topple the regime or to change the regime. That was not the case. He was a reformer, not a revolutionary. In other words, he was asking for reform or change from within the system, not from outside the system. He did not call for, dismantling the royal family in Saudi Arabia, or let's get rid of the royal family, or let's change the regime completely. That was not what he was calling for. He was calling for reform. He was calling for more margin of human rights, more margin of opposition, more margin of representation, more margin of civic and civil engagement. That's what he was asking for, right? He was not like, let's topple the regime and get rid of the royal family. That was not what he was doing. And yet the paradox is the horrible outcome and the horrible consequence. He paid his life in this terrible way as a result for being just simply a reformer, not even a revolutionary. That was one paradox. The second paradox was, some people said, well, why don't you pay attention to other cases besides Jamal Khashoggi? Some people got angry at the amount of international attention that this one incident received, while many, many other instances of police brutality and government brutality and digital authoritarianism and imprisonment of opposition go unnoticed. People simply don't care, or they don't talk about it, or they don't give them enough attention or enough coverage in the media. There were those who were tweeting like, okay, Saudi Arabia killed Jamal Khashoggi. What about all the people killed in Yemen, right? In this country where a child dies every 10 minutes in a war which is completely senseless and totally against human rights and against humanity. Why nobody talks about all of these people who are dying in a country like Yemen, again, by Saudi hands? Why isn't there enough attention to these causes and to these people? Why aren't people equally talking about other journalists and opposition members, whether in Saudi jails or Egyptian jails or Syrian jails or other jails in the Arab world or even in the world at large? Why aren't they given enough attention? So there was this paradoxical feeling of like, yeah, this is really horrible, and it's good that the media is talking about it. But then on the flip side of the coin is, but it's not good that people are not giving similar attention or equal attention to other cases of brutality or authoritarianism or crackdown on opposition. Another paradox was, although this incident or this terrible murder was supposed to silence opposition and to make journalists and dissidents afraid of speaking up and scared for their own lives, we saw that in some cases exactly the opposite happened. So many journalists and young people and protesters and dissidents and opposition figures started to become more emboldened, right? So the regimes were emboldened in a sense that many of them cracked down on opposition hard, but the flip side of the coin is we also saw that there were young people and dissidents and activists and protesters who spoke up and started to really kind of express their own anger and frustration and to vent and to talk and to express their views against the regimes even more. And I would say even from the time that this horrible incident happened in 2018 up till now in 2020, we saw more interest in more press freedom and more journalistic freedom and more discussion of these topics inside and outside the Arab region by organizations like Committee to Protect Journalists and Reporters Without Borders and those who are interested in human rights. And of course, you know, the momentum that happened after the murder of Khashoggi with all of the international attention and also all the movements to say, you know, we stand with him, we are all Jamal Khashoggi, what are we going to do next? We have to honor his memory. So it created this opposite effect of, instead of silencing opposition or dissent, it created more visibility for dissidents and opponents and the cause of press freedom. And finally, the last paradox is it exposed, unfortunately, some kind of hypocrisy on the part of Western regimes and those who are calling for human rights and democratization, all of that stuff, but did not really play an active role to try to bring those responsible to trial or to try to take action, especially, of course, in this case, the United States with the, as I said before, the reports coming from the FBI and the CIA saying that the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman was implicated in this whole murder, and if he did not order the murder would have never happened. Yet we know that the Trump administration and Trump himself has certain relationships economically and in terms of trade with Saudi Arabia. His own son-in-law, Jared Kushner, has trade transactions and interests with the Saudi Crown Prince and with high-profile members of the Saudi government and Saudi family, which meant that there was lack of accountability and lack of punishment of any sort, and those who are responsible were never really brought to trial or were never really kind of punished for their actions. They were just like a sham trial in Saudi Arabia, implicating some of the law-serving officers who are not the ones who gave the orders for this to happen in the first place, and some of them even went unpunished. So the whole thing was really a sham. It was not even a real trial, and those who are truly responsible for this gruesome murder were never really accountable and were never really brought to justice. And that, of course, is a paradox because the Western world talks about, yeah, we have to protect human rights, but whose human rights are really being protected? That is a big question, right? So we see a lot of that, unfortunately, all of this talk about human rights and protecting human rights, but when it comes to a certain horrible incident like the one we just talked about now, we see that those in power can get away with their own actions unpunished. So all of these are interesting findings and also interesting paradoxes that came out of the Jamal Khashoggi moment. And as we speak right now, we are seeing this ongoing tug of war, this push and pull mechanism between regimes cracking down on dissent and opposition and trying to punish those who did all of the the work on the ground or the work online against the regimes and trying to fight against corruption and violations of human rights, and between the regimes themselves trying to crack down on them and try to really kind of silence them, whether by putting them in jail or silencing them forever by unfortunately killing them and keeping them silenced for good, as in the horrible, gruesome case of Jamal Khashoggi. So I'll stop here and drink some water and allow you to start your Q&A. Thank you so much.
Wow.
Yeah, well, I'm going to start now. First of all, thank you from our side as well. And yeah, we're going to do the hosting, Tom and I, and we're going to try and walk everyone through this session. And we have questions prepared, but we first of all wanted to say that everybody is obviously welcome to ask their own questions. So maybe does anyone has already a question about the lecture just now? All right, then whenever you have a question, just give us a sign. Yeah, our first question, because you already talked a lot about the case, and I think everybody knows the most important information about it already now. We wanted to talk a little bit about the reactions of the other countries. You talked a little bit about that already, but especially the US and Turkey and Saudi Arabia, how could you compare the reactions, and also what is your opinion on that regarding the media accountability?
Yeah, I mean, in the case of the United States, of course, we have to distinguish between two things, right? You have the government and then you have civil society. This is very important. And maybe the same should be also applicable to other countries. Like when you say, you know, what is, you know, Germany's reaction to something, right? There's the German government, but there's also the German people. In some cases, you can have people on the same page, agreeing on the same points. But in other cases, maybe they don't see things eye to eye, or they don't necessarily always have to agree on everything. So when I talk about the United States, of course, the case of the government, the Trump administration was very shameful in the sense that they did not take any kind of action and did not try to have any kind of accountability. As I said in my talk now, that, you know, there is definitely clear evidence that the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman himself is the one who ordered this horrible, gruesome murder of this Saudi journalist. And had it not been for the Crown Prince ordering his murder, this murder would not have happened. Yet, despite the CIA and the FBI saying that with high confidence reports, that they're sure that this happened, the government did not take any kind of action. There was some attempt to try to bring this to justice, but the Trump administration, unfortunately, and Trump himself did not act upon it because of the economic interests that links him and links his son-in-law and his family and members of his government to the Saudi regime directly. So as a result of that, there was silencing of any kind of accountability in this particular case. And I wrote an article, I shared some of these articles with Monica, I think she shared them with you as well. One of them was about that this really shakes the moral authority, right, of a country like the United States that is supposed to be like a beacon of democracy and a protector of human rights and a protector of free speech and freedom of expression around the world. And when it exhibits this kind of behavior, this really has terrible and negative implications because it sends a very bad message. And the message is, as we are seeing day in and day out, you can be a young person if you speak up against your regime, whether you're talking about Syria or Egypt or, you know, Saudi Arabia or other countries in the region, you can be forcibly disappeared. Some people just disappear, literally, and their family will never find out where they went, which is a horrible thing. Because, you know, if God forbid you are in prison, at least your family knows that you are in prison, right? They can go and get you a lawyer and try to get you out of jail. But if they have no clue where you are and you completely disappear all of a sudden, that's a much worse scenario. So it does not give any kind of protection, in this case, to young dissidents or activists or journalists or opponents who might be forcibly disappeared or go to jail, or of course, in some horrible cases, even killed. And when I say killed, by the way, there are other ways through which people lose their lives. Like now when we talk about the pandemic, if you arrest a 65-year-old man with pre-existing conditions, as for example, the case of Mohammed Munir, the Egyptian journalist who was arrested, and he was 65 years old, he had high blood pressure, hypertension, he had heart condition, and he was put in jail. That was like a death sentence because he contracted the coronavirus, and after leaving the prison a few days later, he died. So when I say died or murdered or killed, doesn't have to be by, you know, the gruesome way, excuse me, the gruesome way like what happened with Khashoggi. You know, if you're arrested, then you are put in a very, very confined cell in jail with a very big, large number of other prisoners in the midst of a pandemic, like the coronavirus pandemic, that is like a death sentence because you can lose your life. And that's why human rights organizations are saying, be careful, especially now. The regimes are doing these kinds of tricks. They would imprison you, put you in jail, you get the virus, and then a few days later, you can die from it. So these are all mechanisms. So the United States reaction definitely was very disappointing. Definitely, there is no question about it. The Saudi reaction, of course, we talked about the process where they completely denied it. Oh, it never happened. They even had this guy who was dressed like Khashoggi, who left the embassy, right, from the back door, and they tried to film this person. Oh, he left the embassy. He was still alive. You know, don't worry. And of course, all of that stuff turned out to be a complete lie and a complete sham, because gradually we started to find out exactly what happened. So they started with denial and then trying to fabricate the whole thing. And then gradually, we started to find out the terrible, horrible reality. But then even up till this moment, there has been no accountability and nobody was brought to justice, except, as I said before, in a very sham, you know, even laughable trial. And the high profile officers were never charged and they got away with it. And of course, the Crown Prince himself is untouched. So that is another disappointment. The case of Turkey, again, some people were not very happy about the Turkish reaction. And they even started to question, like, oh, are you guys, you know, did you guys take this even seriously? Like, this happened on Turkish land and this happened in the Saudi embassy, you know, in Turkey. So how come the Turkish government did not take more action to really expose the facts? The Turks will say, you know, oh, we did our best. We tried to investigate. We tried to collect information. We tried to find out what happened. But I think a lot of people were also disappointed and they were not satisfied with the reaction from the Turkish government in this particular case. And they believe that there should have been much more accountability and much more involvement and much more responsibility on the part of Turkish authorities as well, to try to really dig for the truth and find out exactly what happened. So unfortunately, you have this political sphere where interests are prevailing, not human rights.
Okay, then in your talk, you've talked about these paradoxes, and in one of your articles we got sent, you also wrote about them, and there you summarized the effects of the Khashoggi murder 1 year later in 2019, and now it's again 1 year later. What would you say were the long-term effects of this scandal? Does this momentum which you described, does it keep on moving?
Yes, I see the momentum going in both directions. And that is the interesting paradox, right? Because you see the push and pull mechanism, and I ended my talk or concluded by saying we have an ongoing push and pull mechanism, a certain dynamic. What do I mean by that? I see both. The regimes are continuing to really go after opposition. Many of them are cracking down very hard on opponents, on dissidents, on protesters, on activists, on journalists, you know, and that's why you have, you know, journalists from organizations like Al Jazeera, for example, who are arrested in Egypt. Just, you know, a few days ago, we have young people who are members of the Egyptian, Initiative for Human Rights, were arrested in Egypt and put to trial. Some of these were simply researchers doing their job, or professors or activists. Nobody is immune. Nobody is protected. You can speak up and you're going to pay the price. And the regimes are sending the message loud and clear. So that is obviously increasing. It is not decreasing. But in parallel and in an opposite direction, as I said also in my talk, you can also see that the good side is many of the dissidents and the opponents and the activists and the journalists are continuing to also talk more and express more and criticize more and be more outspoken and be more visible. And that was the kind of paradox I was referring to in my talk, that despite all of this harsh crackdown and all of this harsh brutality from regimes, yes, there are those who can get intimidated, but there are also many more who are emboldened and they continue to talk. And I'm hoping that really with the shift now in, moving to the new US administration, the winning of Joe Biden, a lot of people are looking at the new administration in the US and saying we hope and pray they're going to step up and they're going to become accountable, and they're going to try to really put some of these dictators and brutal regimes, really put them in place, at least try to show them that there is some kind of international attention, that the world is watching and observing, that they cannot just continue to act in this kind of completely irresponsible, uncontrolled, dangerous way and put everyone in harm's way. Nobody is immune, whether you are a professor, an activist, a writer, a journalist, you name it. You are not immune. You can still face very harsh and very dire consequences, losing your job or losing your freedom or even losing your life. So a lot of people in this part of the world, in the Arab world, including my own home country, Egypt, are looking and observing, and some of them are saying, we hope that the new incoming US administration under Joe Biden will start to have a different course of action and will start to at least not cozy up to these dictators and have these kind of very close, cozy relationships with a regime like the one in Saudi Arabia, but rather try to return back to the idea of the moral leadership of the United States on the international front, and try to really show dictators that if they take these types of horrible actions, there is going to be some form of consequence. So I hope that this message is going to prevail moving forward. That's my hope. That's what we are praying and hoping for.
Dear students, can I just drop in one question, because it directly refers to what you just said. How about us in Europe? Are we a relevant factor or not at all? This would be very interesting. So what can we do as Europeans?
Absolutely very important. And a lot of people, were appreciating the fact that there was a clear, opposition and clear, vocalization in Europe coming from, countries like Germany and France and the UK and others, talking about these notions of respecting human rights in the Arab world, respecting human rights in the Arab region. I know that there were civil society organizations and groups and activists in many of the European countries who spoke very clearly and very loudly against what happened in the case of Jamal Khashoggi and other human rights violations in the region. I only hope that there's going to be more of this kind of activism, not just on the part of the the regimes or the governments in Europe, but also even from the European civil societies and organizations and citizens, continue to shine the light on these kinds of cases and continue to speak up against them and continue to show the Arab world that you care about these notions and you care about these cases, and continue to speak up against them. And hopefully in coordination also with the new US administration, there can be this kind of momentum coming from both the United States and from European countries. Because you know that the Trump administration has isolated itself a lot from even its traditional allies, like in NATO and the European Union. And somehow I say that the policy of America first became the policy of America alone. So there is some form of isolation. I hope that under the Joe Biden administration, there is going to be more coordination with European allies, with European countries, to try to create this kind of momentum of trying to send a message to dictatorial regimes that this kind of irresponsible, dangerous behavior cannot be acceptable. And I think this is going to be very important to protect the activists and the journalists in the Arab world.
You just talked a lot about Biden and that people are hoping that it's going to be better because of it. What is your opinion on that? Are you hopeful as well, or do you think that it might be false?
I have what is called cautionary optimism. So I am cautiously optimistic, right? Because at the end of the day, even when we talk about, the United States, or Susan's question about Europe, that's awesome. These can be allies, they can be, advocates. But at the end of the day, I always say, nobody can give you your democracy and nobody can give you your freedom, right? You have to earn it. So nobody is going to come and give freedom or democracy to the Arab world. The whole notion of, George W. Bush, we're going to bring democracy to Iraq. You cannot do that. You cannot just go and say, good morning, here's your freedom. It does not come with the breakfast, that doesn't come this way, The people themselves in the region and inside each and every country, they also have to design and to craft and to build their own model of freedom and their own model of democracy. And it's not a one-size-fits-all as well. Just like we were talking before about, there is no one-size-fits-all activism, there is no one-size-fits-all freedom, there is no one-size-fits-all, feminism, there is no one-size-fits-all accountability. All of these notions, they take different forms and shapes and contexts in different countries. So I believe that at the end of the day, it is up to the Arab people and the people in the Arab region to create and to build their own freedom and democracy. But it would be very helpful if they can really have strong allies in the United States and in Europe to try to help us on the road to more democratization and more reform. So I see this as a supplementary role, as a catalyst, as a helpful factor, but it's not definitely the first or the most important one.
Okay, then just looking at the time, I think we got 4 more minutes. So I would like to ask.
Time flies very quickly.
And then coffee.
Yeah.
I'm going to have coffee after that.
So I just would like to ask you one final question, and that is, which lesson would you give us? Which lesson should we take from this lecture, from this course, as students of journalism here in Dortmund? Yeah.
Think about your accountability. Who are you accountable for? Ask yourself every single moment, every single day, right? When you go to work, when you exercise journalism, when you write, when you speak, when you address the media, ask yourself the question, who am I doing this for? Keep the notion of accountability always in front of your eyes. Think about your moral and social responsibility. Think about your responsibility for the truth, for saying the truth, for being honest and truthful to yourself, to your own values, to your own profession of journalism, to sharing the truth and the reality with your audiences and with the public. Don't be intimidated and don't be scared. Know that you are in a Western country, a democratic country that gives you a margin of freedom to speak up, and that you are not facing the very dire consequences that others in other parts of the world are facing. And therefore, take advantage of this margin of freedom and make it work for you, so that you are an advocate for the truth, not just for your own people, but for people in every part of the world.
Wow.
Okay, yeah, I think
thank you.
Because of the time, we would stop here now. Is that right? Yeah, okay. Then thank you very much. That was really interesting. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to participate with all of you today. I shared a number of articles with Monica, and I'm sure she shared it with all of you. I'll be happy to share other materials as well, some of my own writings and articles. I'm happy to share them with Monica, so she can share them with all of you as well. And it's really a pleasure to be with all of you today. I wish you best of luck, and I hope you're always going to be a voice of truth everywhere you go. Thank you very much.
Thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
very much.
Thank you.
Have a good time. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Und wir sehen uns alle in 2 Wochen wieder zu unserer nächsten Sitzung. Die Referenten werden beschickt und wir werden dann die nächsten spannenden Diskussionen haben. Vielen Dank auch nochmal an die Moderatoren.
Ja,
ne? Genau.
Well done. Dass ich das sagen darf. Das haben Sie gut gemacht, Rika und Torben. Sie haben Ihre vorbereitete Orchestrierung zur Seite gelegt, weil das super war. Das hat mir gut gefallen, wie flexibel Sie reagiert haben und dann trotzdem noch Ihre Fragen, die Moderation in die Hand genommen haben. Sehr gut.
Danke.
Danke.
Tschüss allesamt.
Danke an alle, genau.
War toll. Wir freuen uns.
Ich habe noch eine Frage.
Ja,
Ich habe noch eine Frage. Es gibt noch ein paar Leute, die noch keine Referate zugeteilt bekommen haben. Wie regeln wir das?
Ist das nicht aufgemacht, dieses letzte Fenster für den... Also wir hatten noch mal so ein paar Referatsthemen. Wenn das noch nicht aufgemacht ist, ich kümmere mich drum, ja? Also wir wollten noch mal einen neuen Termin dann anhängen hinten mit Referatsthemen. Vielleicht ist das irgendwie untergegangen, weil es war jetzt echt stressig bei vielen, auch bei Frau Kloß und so. Wir kümmern uns drum, leier ich gleich direkt an, okay? Dass Sie sich dann...
Alles klar, okay. Danke.
Okay.
schreibst du nochmal auf.
Danke.
Ich hätte auch noch eine Frage. Frau Lengauer, können Sie Frau Khamis Literatur ins Moodle stellen dann?
Mach ich gleich, ja.
Danke.
Danke auch.
Okay.
Okay,
Dann haben wir es, ne?
dann haben wir es.
Gut. Also, schönes Wochenende. Tschüss. Bleiben Sie gesund.
Ja.
Tschüss. So, Aufzeichnung. Wo ist sie?